Good morning. So here's what I struggle with like networking things. Like we always are like, hey, what do you do? We sort of like introduce ourselves as our business as opposed to who we are. So what I do for my business is I life coach and I specialize in grief support. But I'm also a mom, a spouse, a survivor of loss to suicide. I am a divorcee. I am what would sort of be considered a single parent, right? I am a huge fan of Brene Brown, obviously, which is why we're all here. So just wanted to like, give a little insight into who I am and say thank you for your patience with the fact that I have managed to acquire laryngitis in the last day and a half. So, patience, and I figure I'm in good company. My goal is to always engage people I'm with in thinking through things that come up with them. It's much more interesting when I'm not talking at all of you, and we're sort of engaged in a little more of a dialogue. We'll work to really get through the content efficiently so that we get all of it, but discussion is always welcome. With that in mind, when we're dealing with things that can bring up all of our stuff, know that participation, worksheets, activities, discussion is completely optional. If you find during the course of things, you're like, oh my gosh, this is super triggering, or this is super all of my things are way too up. I will not be offended if you take off and you don't come back. It's okay, because even when we're not specifically dealing with grief topics, when we're talking about trust, we're talking about boundaries, we're talking about what we can and can't control, often that sort of brings up things that we're dealing with our work, with our life, our family, with our friends. So just, there's my sort of disclaimer as we move through this. So where I actually like to start with this presentation is sort of on the flip side of what you would think of your worksheet, nice big blank space. Who is familiar with Stephen Covey? Right? Yes. So he outlines the circles of control in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Right? Stephen models it this way, right? Where we have what we can control in the middle, and as it moves further away from us, right? Because what can we control? Me, you, right? I can control me. The further things get away from me, there are things I can't control, right? So Stephen models it this way, which, for some of us that is a really effective visual. Some people break it down into these are just completely separate pools, right? Things I can control, things I can influence, and things I can't control. There are these nice little separate pockets. I make 3 different lists. For me, this model is most effective in my brain. And again, we all function differently. We all see things differently. We all process information differently. I see it more as a Venn diagram. I've got what I can control over here. I've got what I can't control on the other side, and where they sort of intersect is where there's some level of influence, not to be confused with control, because we don't actually have control over those things. So for example, right, I said earlier today, it's Wednesday and it's not snowing, but look out the window, now it's snowing again. So, do I have any control over the weather? No, nope, not at all. But I can control how I choose to feel about that. And how I choose to feel about it, that's really funny. Usually it's snowing so hard when I present that people don't show up. But anyway, it just cracks me up. I talk about my family a lot when I share. They've given me permission to do this. My 6-year-old loves it when I talk about her, so, I find that to be fair territory. I cannot control my daughter's behavior. Right? Yes or no? Can I control my daughter's behavior?
No.
What I can control is what? My behavior. My reaction to her behavior. And by me being in control of what I can control, I then model what appropriate behavior or responses to things would be, which then allows me to create the circle of influence, right? But at the end of the day, I can model it all day long, right? Do I have any control over whether or not she takes that modeling and does anything with it? No, I don't have any control. So I leave blank space on the back of your worksheet so that whether it's as we go through this presentation, if you're sitting writing stuff, like I am not offended if you're not looking at me. In fact, if you're like engaged in something else, it probably makes me feel a little less like stared at. Because being seen is really hard. So then we move on to Brene Brown. Who's familiar with Brene Brown?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so clearly I'm amongst like-minded people and friends. Being seen requires vulnerability, and it's not always easy to do that. So I encourage you to think through what makes most sense to you when you think about how you process, what you can control, what you can't control, and what you can influence, and where those things meet for you. And sort of keep this in the back of your mind as we talk through the trust pieces, because all of these things come back together, okay? So then we move into Brene Brown, and in several different pieces of her literature, she sort of refers to it in different ways, right? But it's either 7 pillars, 7 elements, her 7 sort of what has come from her research as sort of the 7 primary pieces that go into trust. Regardless what the relationship is, it does not matter if it's with your child, with your spouse, with an employee, with an employer, say it's with your boss, right? It doesn't matter what relationship we're talking about. These are the things that emerged from her research that sort of define the pieces of the puzzle to how we can establish and maintain trust, okay? Again, it's all on your thing, so you don't have to write it down. That's the thing I hate about having feel like you have to take notes. I'd rather you just process it and take notes on your process instead. So we start with boundaries. Her research defines boundaries as simply making clear what is okay and what is not okay and why. Does that sound loaded? It doesn't to me. It's just like this is what it is. I think boundaries feel really hard for all of us because we operate into the realm of then projecting what we can't control into what this is, right? So all we can do and all we have control over is simply making clear what is and is not okay and why. But then we have to hold that space and hold what is true for us, knowing full well that we don't have any control over whether or not somebody else is going to understand what our boundaries are necessarily going to respect what our boundaries are, but knowing that we get to continue to make choices about what that is. So for example, with my daughter, this is written on my whiteboard in my dining room, so I can reference it all the time. And it drives her crazy that I quote this at her all the time, right? And she'll be like, Mom, you're so unfair. Mom, you're so mean. I'm like, no, girl, I'm just making clear what is and is not okay. And I always tell you why. Always tell you why. So, girl, the boundary simply is you cannot stand 6 inches from the television. You cannot stand 6 inches from the television because it's not good for your brain, it's not good for your eyesight, and frankly, you can knock the TV over, and then we'd all be set, right? So all I'm doing is setting a really clear expectation. When we aren't clear about what is and is not okay, is when our boundaries get all murky. This clarity starts with us, and then allows us to create that, right? When I talk about and I think about my children, really Boundaries are what allow her to feel safe. She knows what is clearly expected of her and what is not expected of her, why that's an expectation. And then from there, right, we move into reliability, which is simply doing what you say you'll do. So I think of it as an example with the television with my daughter. This is what the boundary is, this is what the expectation is, and what the result of not following that expectation is, I'll turn the TV off. So you're in control of you, you make a choice. You can either sit where it's appropriate or the TV goes off, right? Reliability is about if she does not respect that boundary, and she doesn't honor what the expectation is, that I then do what I say I'll do. Does she trust me if I just continually say, back up, back up, back up, I know I've told you I'm going to turn it off, but then I don't follow through and actually turn off the TV? And that can then get applied to later things. Like the television scenario is like really small little thing, right? But if we don't do what we say we're going to do, we can't establish trust with others because there's no follow-through. You need the people in your life and your world, and you need for you to know that you will follow through on what those things are, right? Dang it, why is it always like that? All right, anyway, so, but you can take this into context with like employees too, right? If you like think about it in a work environment, if you've set clear expectations about what needs to be done and what it is, right? And you're like, but then it's like there's never any sort of follow through on the next thing, or you have an employee that like all you expect, like you have trust with somebody who doesn't do what they say they'll do. Yeah, I'll get that project done. Yeah, I'll get that project done. And 2 weeks later, you're like, okay, sure, I'll give you grace. But eventually, like, do you trust that person to follow through and accomplish things? Like, if you have a project later, are you going to go back to that same person and say, hey, take this on for me? Because they don't do what they say they do, right? So this is one of my favorite ones with my family, and it's accountability. And the definition that Brene Brown came from the research for her is you own your mistakes, apologize, and make amends. We're all human, right? Like, we're not perfect. If we were perfect, then, I mean, life would be really boring, actually, I think. It would not be very interesting. But my children, my stepdaughter included, all of us actually, I think it's hard, right, for ourselves even to be like, wow, I really screwed that up. I didn't do it right. I mean, I am the master mom of like having to go back and be accountable to my 6-year-old. Because like, wow, girl, I seriously did not handle that well. I yelled and screamed and got really angry instead of taking 5 minutes to take a deep breath, stay collected, and model what it means to like really be in it. And it was not my best. Next time I'll try to be better, right? And that's what gets us through. And that's actually what I want to model for my daughter when it comes to, like, I can't control her behavior, she can't control mine either, right? But at the end of the day, like, I can control, like, showing up for her and being like, hey, I screwed up, so that she later can come back to me and say, hey, Mom, I screwed up. I didn't do it well. And trust that the response from me will be saying, oh, girl, thanks for being so accountable for what that is. I'm so proud of you. Like, and trust that all of that relationship will be maintained, right? So then, from accountability, we move into fault. We don't share information or experiences that are not ours to share. I think this is one of those things that is particularly applicable sometimes in work environments, applicable in family environments too. right? And in family relationships. But like, we've all been in one of those jobs where you've got like the coworker that comes and like talks about Sally, right? Oh my God, did you hear about so-and-so, Sally, and blah, 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 and all this stuff that's going on, right? Not only is it it's not just our responsibility to not be Sally, right? Don't be Sally. But also to be able to say to Sally, hey, you know, like, so-and-so, like, if they want to come share with me what's going on with them, I'd be happy to listen, but like, it's really not my place to get that information from you. And what that does with the person you're then interacting with is establish trust with them that there is a boundary around, I hold confidence with things that are not mine to share. For people like me who work in coaching, especially when you think about grief support, right? Obviously, there's confidentiality inside the walls of my office. Yes, it's outlined in all of my paperwork and all of those things, but like that also applies outside of those confidential relationships, right? You trust that your doctor is not going to share your medical history. You trust that, you know, your counselor or your therapist or your coach or whoever is going to hold what you're working through and what's going on in confidence and not share what is not theirs to share. But this applies to all of our relationships, right? I share in this presentation stories about my daughter and stories about my spouse and things like that because I've obtained permission to share stories about relatable experiences, right? But it's important that if that wasn't the case, that I not share things that aren't mine or my experiences. Integrity is maybe my favorite one. This is the one I quote every single day. Choosing courage over comfort, choosing what is right over what is fun, fast, and easy, and practicing your values, not just professing them. This is how I try to live my life. With every interaction that I have with anybody. My daughter says, Mom, why can't you just let me have the thing I want? I go, because, girl, then I wouldn't be practicing my values. I'd be talking a great big game and then not following through on what any of that is, right? I'd rather fight with you now about your sugar intake so that I don't have to worry about you being sick later, right? Or whatever those processes are. Like choosing what is right over what is fun, fast, or easy is, for example, right? Who has kids? I'm like, not everybody has kids, but nieces, nephews, children that you've ever been around, sometimes it's not relatable. But my daughter is super fan of leaving her stuff everywhere. Trash, dishes, whatever. And would it be a whole lot easier for me to just pick it all up and take it to the kitchen or put it away? Sometimes it's necessary, right? Sometimes it needs to be that way. But what is right is to fight the fight where I say, hey, come pick your stuff up. But I don't want to put my stuff away. Well, if you don't put your stuff away, then I take your stuff and it goes away. Wah! Right? But what I am modeling and providing for her is more important and what she will learn from that than doing what's easy, which is just to do it for her. Man, we think about the practicing our values and not just professing them. Like that's maybe some of the hardest stuff though. Right? Anybody relate to that? But it's like so much easier to like talk really big game than it is to like actually do it. I sort of feel that way like every time I stand up in front of a group of people and I'm like, I don't know if anybody's with me, not with me, maybe like who cares, I have no idea. But who would I be to go tell anybody I'm working with to be brave and be vulnerable and go do the things that scare you, like public speaking, with a camera on, I even stayed in the zone, for the record. I could have wandered over there, but I didn't. I was told very specifically. But not do it myself, right? It is so much easier to say the things than it is to do the things. But if we're not practicing our values, how is anyone in our world going to trust that when we encourage them to do it, that we can stand by them with that we see them, that we're really with them in how all of that goes. Then we move to non-judgment. I can ask for what I need, you can ask for what you need. We can talk about how we feel without judgment. Anybody in the room feel like this is a really hard thing? It's a really hard thing. And what I would say, for me, and maybe this is relatable or not, but I find it much harder to talk about what I need without judging myself. I don't generally judge other people. I feel like I'm a pretty judgment-free zone. I've gone and experienced a whole lot of stuff in my life and made a whole lot of mistakes and gone down a ton of rabbit holes and done all the things, and someone's gonna show up and ask me for what they need and talk to me about how they feel. I'm not grounding judgment about that. But me showing up with somebody else, even my spouse, showing up and being able to say to them, oh my God, I have not slept in a week because my 6-year-old is awake again every 2 hours. And I'm really tired and I feel totally worn out and I really need help, without feeling overwhelming mom guilt that I'm then putting on to somebody else, something that feels like it should be mine, and judging myself. I think showing up for ourselves with this is a lot harder maybe sometimes than showing up with other people. And lastly, about generosity. And this one, I feel like, in all the times that I've shared this information with groups, this one sort of gets sticky for people, right? Extending the most generous interpretation to the intentions, words, and actions of others. Does that sound easy? This is really hard, but you also have to apply this in the realm of boundaries. Right? I can offer the most generous interpretation to somebody else's intentions, words, and actions. But that does not mean that I have to allow myself to be walked all over, to be treated in a way that is unkind or not okay. It does not justify people's bad behavior. You can understand what's going on, where something comes from for somebody else, and apply empathy to that, but that does not mean that you have to continue to allow yourself to be in it, right? But then we go back to boundaries, which is being clear about what is okay and what's not okay and why, right? I can understand that you have, for example, with my spouse, I can understand that he had a really terrible day at work and he's really super grumpy, and he's, or actually better. He is much better about this than I am, where he can understand where all my stuff is coming from, but it doesn't make it okay for me to throw all of my energy all over him, right? Now, he is really good about setting some boundaries around that, too, and I've gotten really good about being accountable for my behavior. Do you see how it all sort of cycles back on itself? You can't take any one of these without the other things with it. They all work together to create this whole picture of how we interact with each other and how we create interpersonal relationships that create success, right? Again, you can understand that maybe, you've got extenuating circumstances with an employee who, there's all of these things going on, right? And recognizing what those things are, there's only But there's also only so much grace for some of that sometimes too. Like, how do we find the help that we need with what's others, right? Can understand when are you going to take action. So that's where that sort of gets sticky. I like to apply this to all of my world though and assume that people are doing the best they can with what they have to work with at any given time. What it comes back to is like me recognizing that what I'm in control of is me. And the other thing that I really like, and on the bottom of that sheet, it has how she applies all of those things to self-trust. And that tends to be what I come back to for myself a lot. Did I make clear what is okay and what is not okay and why? Because if I didn't take and do my part of making clear boundaries and setting clear boundaries, like, there's no room to give anybody space to like operate within that. I don't have any control over what anybody does with that. But I can't expect, like, if I haven't made clear to my daughter what's expected, can I expect her to do it? Is that reasonable? So yeah, I don't know. I'd like to sort of like, we're sort of in that like 15-minute range, which is great. I got through all the stuff. Yay! We got through all the content. But I feel like, I mean, maybe nobody has any feedback. I did see some head nodding, so like people were processing something. But my favorite part about doing this presentation is hoping that, like, again, I'm not just like talking at people, but there's opportunity for anyone who does want to share to contribute pieces of like major takeaways or what came up for us or things like that. So.
For those of us who've forgotten who Brene Brown is, could you
remind us? So Brene Brown is a researcher who does, like, she calls herself like a researcher, storyteller, because she talks about her life. Sort of the same way that I stand up here and talk about my life. But she accumulates all of these stories from other people to sort of dissect through lines on big things like defining emotions that we all experience, or concepts of trust and things like that. So she does social research by pulling from all of these different experiences and life stories that people have to sort of find the through lines. What are the common experiences that we all have? She's written, I have some with me, but she's written Braving, which is not actually where, you would think that that's where this comes from, but actually Braving the Wilderness is where, Daring Greatly talks about this too. Daring Greatly, Braving the Wilderness, The Gifts of Imperfection was one of her first ones. She studies shame and vulnerability and, all the really hard, sticky stuff that, we don't always want to talk about. Yeah, for sure. I should have gone through that at the beginning. See, I've done this, and people are like, yeah, I know what that is. It's like, great, I can bypass that. Let's just jump from there to there.
She's a great Netflix special, too. She talks about all the movies.
Okay. Yeah. And which one did you just say?
Netflix.
Oh, Netflix, yeah. I love listening to her talk about trying to make that, and she's like, she has the same relationship with that.
I think I heard that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that Netflix series is sort of based loosely around her most recent novel, which is Atlas of the Heart, which has like a wait list from the public library of like 1 million people long, but it's not super expensive, so I usually recommend people just go buy it. But she outlines just like definitions of all of these different sort of emotions and experiences that we all sort of have in common. So I find that it's a really good language tool for sort of finding ways to talk about things that sometimes feel not easy to talk about. I got like 3 and they all went up at the same time. Who wants to take turns? How about we work that way? Is that okay, ladies? In the back? Okay.
In business or lifestyle, how do you deal with or help someone who's quick to judge, who jump to judgment right away? Whether they have all the information or not, they tend to jump out to a place of judging things really quickly and throwing up walls and not wanting to really listen after that. Is there any secrets to breaking that cycle?
This is the answer you're not gonna like, okay? Which is, at the end of the day, it all actually comes back to you. So, again, we don't have any control over what their behavior pattern is, right? Now, I would say, depending on, like, you'd have to dig into, like, what's the dynamic between you and this specific person, or that person and whoever they're interacting with. What are the boundaries around that relationship, right? And you can't do anybody else's work for them. You can just continue to model for somebody else by showing up for yourself in what that looks like. Now, that sounds like a really convoluted answer, but really all of the change that starts in any of my relationships really comes back to me. Every challenge I have with any person I'm interacting with, if I'm charged, right? And usually when I interact with someone who's like immediately like jumps to judgment, it's like so far, like sometimes the opposite of who I am, right? I'm like, I don't even understand you. Like, why are you going there? I'm so confused. But like to be able to see that as a mirror and reflection for, all right, well, it's triggering, it's setting something off and charging something inside of me because clearly I have something I need to work on around what that is, right? So I don't know if that's really helpful because there is no like, yay, here's a quick fix to any relationship, anything.
Let's see if I can explain it a little bit. Maybe that'll help.
Maybe.
Because maybe you can help me.
Well, and I'll be over there too, but yeah.
I work in sort of the futurist world where I'm trying to help organizations see a different future than they're currently in.
Okay.
And one of the biggest barriers is they want to judge things before we've even gone there. They want to immediately set the barriers up and not want to be open-minded.
Sure. I would say the first thing that comes to me with that is, are those the clients you want to work with?
That's a good question. No.
So what you cannot control what your clients do and what they come back to, but you can control which clients you choose to work with. Right?
It's hard to know in advance sometimes, but
Oh, well,
you're right.
no.
You're
But
totally right.
You can say
what I like to
you're be willing.
here's the hardest thing, and I don't know how many people in here like are like doing their like trying to have their own small business. That's like it's just me, or it's me and like one other person, or it's like, and it's sort of like you have that sense of having to get out of sort of desperation of like, I need this client, when in reality, if you set the intention for what you want to bring in, the right people start showing up. The people that will say yes, the people that will be like, yeah, let's try anything. I'm up for it. Let's go. You know what I mean? Like, I have no idea what that's going to look like, but I'm ready to try. When you start saying no to the clients that don't work for you, the clients that will start showing up. It's like the law, those like universal laws of, I'm also like that, by the way, hippy-dippy, like woo-woo, like manifest your reality person too. I don't always introduce myself as an intuitive life coach because some people are like, yeah, that's too like hippy-dippy for me, but it is true. Like we do create and bring in what we are perpetually thinking about. Is that more helpful?
Yeah, I think so. I work with teams a lot, so even if there's mostly the whole group's wanting to go, there's always one. There's always one
Well,
person.
and then it's like the team over the one person, and you'd be like, well, I'm gonna work with this person on this team who's on board.
No, I'm with you.
I actually have a question for you. Is this a client that came to you
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, so they want to come to you for looking into the future and working on all that. How I was like sort of hearing it was they're kind of setting up their boundaries with you in that sense? Or is it just, I mean, I just find it interesting that they came to you, but they're like saying, no, no, no.
It's usually just one person in a team of 5 or 6. that
Okay.
Always wants to
Well, I mean, it's
throw the
actually,
cold water on everything.
Yeah.
It's tenets of change management.
Yes.
And it has to do with managing change within an organization. And some people come to it in a negative way or poo-poo it because they're not used to change. What does that mean? for
It's
the
scary, yeah.
organization? It's scary. And so if you look at some of those tenets and how the organizationally put it together, you can plan something on how to implement change in an easy way so that that work can get done and move forward without scaring them off.
Yeah, it's like a learning, everyone learns differently type of thing, so you have to take an approach from something else.
do that thing. We're at like 2 people
Yeah.
back here that
Sorry.
raise their hand. Is that okay, Ed? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so,
Okay.
my leadership team, we did, the Dare to Lead workshop.
Uh-huh.
So we all went through it, we committed to the 12 weeks that we did it. Really hard work, we put a lot into it. And I guess for me, how do I keep that momentum of, we did this really hard work, we worked through shame, which was so difficult as a leadership team, right, all the weeks. And we've put some of the pieces into our teams, and we're trying to, bring the whole staff in. How do you keep, like, do you have any, like, tips on how you just keep that braving mentality kind of to continue so that we don't lose focus on it? Is it really just like putting the poster up in the room and like having the words there? Is it, like, yeah, do you have any pointers on that?
It is, so the way you change any behavior, right, is with relentless consistency. So it is, yeah, it can be as simple as having the poster on the wall and referencing it all the time in every conversation, right? Swear to God, like every conversation I have with my family, they're so sick of this, right? But all the time, right? And the hope is, now granted, my spouse, like old dog, new tricks, right? And the 17-year-old is like, yeah, well, I'll take it or leave it. My 6-year-old, I know that if I stay the course with continuing to implement that in my life and who I am, how I'm going to show up, and I continue to use the language and continue to come back to it, it then becomes default, right? But you have to not get complacent and let it go. Is everyone going to be as invested as you are? No. Is everyone in my family as invested as I am? No. But it still changes the way I show up in my world, which then changes every interaction that I have with anybody. So, yeah, it really is that simple. Put the poster up and reference it and use it, right? Use the tools that you got from that and use them all the time, because then it will become habit.
So much of this resonates with me. I use this in my practice, and I actually do what you're saying, the creating habits part. And I have conversations every day about judgment and shame. So I'm a clinical nutritionist, and I don't do calories in and out and weighing. And I have the funniest conversations with people like, do you talk to everybody like this? And I'm like, yeah, pretty much. So I filter out, to this question, I filter out that, when there's 20 pounds tomorrow, and I have really intense conversations about judgment and shame, because so much of it exists, unfortunately, around food still to this day, like regardless of age. And so I have these funny things like mind your own plate, and I do what she says, which is like, there's profanity in it, but I cut that out.
Well, come out. Oh, I was like,
Yeah. Pretty impressive that I restrained. But I have it on, it's on the fridge and everything else, and I think, we really live in a judgment and shame society.
profanity was been welcome. There's a whole Netflix series on like the history of swearing, by the way, and how healthy it actually is for designated trust things. Like people put like their hand in a bowl of ice water, and those who could not swear like lasted half the amount of time as people who could like spout anyway. So just so you know, there is healthy outlet. Now I can say that like directing profanities at someone in a really cool way, not the same.
I don't think a week
But-
goes by that someone doesn't tell me, did you see that study on the intelligence with profanity? I'm like, I know.
So yeah, I'm getting to like, we have 5 minutes, which is awesome, because usually at this point it's like, anyway,
I was just going to say that I think we're all, number one, live at different levels. We grow at different levels and at different speeds. And a lot of that has to do with identifying. I'm also an alchemical counselor, so I do know that. So I have to take into consideration whether the person is emotionally ready to move on, or does he need a little nudging, or basically present to them that if you're coming from wanting a quick fix, well, you can get a quick fix, but it's not going to last. But if you want a real permanent change, it's going to take some time. And to address the other information, the question about a lot of people have trouble wanting to get to there and they don't want to put an effort and all that. What I noticed is, what I did is I graduated it and start working with them. They really want to go there. Everybody wants to get their fixed. Everybody wants it tomorrow, right now, without doing work. But what I noticed is, in some of them, I graduated their progress. I started having them log in their progress. From the moment they said, I want to change. And you will be amazed when having them journal, they start writing progress, literally every day. And just having them bring it up, having them be reflective to them and say, look, you did this, you did this. All of a sudden, that matters to them. All of a sudden, that's progress. That's the many steps that build something bigger. And that I found that if I just keep pointing it out, you are progressing, the fire gets going, the momentum gets going, and then all of a sudden they're excited. And that's when I start backing up. And then, to me, it's a lack of identifying that you are going somewhere, either forward or back. And that is important to me. And that's how I help other people to go over these gaps. Anyways.
For sure. Yeah. I would say that's absolutely true. And for me, again, going back to my favorite one, integrity, right? Like, I feel like being in my life and being in the line of work I am, like, I better be practicing what I preach. If I'm going to sit down with anyone to help them work through any process that they're going through, I better be doing my own work. I better be showing up. Am I awesome at it every day? No, I'm not. And there are days that I could go back and go, wow, I really didn't do that well. All right, well, I did my best, and next time I'll do better. And as long as we continue to do things where it's like, are we doing the baby steps? And really, like, these concepts don't ever go away. Every big issue, every major problem I have, and this will be my last thought, and then we'll move on. I sit down and I do this. Like, I will write out with like really hard, sticky situations, what can I control? What can't I control? Where are the moments where are the places that I can influence what this is, right? I can control how I react. I could control the way I have this conversation. I can control the way I show up with what this is. I can't control whether or not it's received. I can't control whether or not someone hears what I have to say. But if I continue to show up in the best way as I can, then maybe I can help to model what things could look like. And with time, things will start to look and feel different for people. And you keep practicing every day. Anyway, I'm glad you all joined me. And I will be over there for a little while. If anybody wants to come chat, share insights, I have business cards. I do a free coaching session for any people, so I'd welcome any great connections. So I'll be over there.